you can see that just fine. Okay. And you're welcome to join in on the Discord, and we can talk while reading this, because this book is 2,000 pages. So, in situations like this, at least, I don't blame people for saying theory seems a little inaccessible. And actually, before I begin, why don't I go into why I wanted to do this? Because, there is a common string to say, like, that theory is inaccessible and it's okay not to. And I agree with that to some extent. But I still think that, you should educate yourself, and that, the more information you have to work with, the more readily you can critique, the situations you find yourself in. And so, while I'm reading this, I want to see if I can't relate it back to, the situations we find ourselves in, and to, the modern world. So, with that, sit down, get a drink, whether it be, water, liquor, coffee, whatever piques your fancy. I'm going to get real comfy in my chair, and we'll begin. Okay, let's see. Looks a little weird, but works fine. Alright, so, the introduction. So, capital, by Marx, exists as an opposite paradigm to free market economics. Both paradigms have academics who have built subsequent theories to support their views. Today, most modern markets operate as a mixed economy, that is, a capitalistic, tempered with the ideas to promote the social welfare, not just production and allocation efficiency. The political pendulum shifts one way or the other, depending on the collective unconsciousness of the time. I recommend that you read the original theories of economists of the past. Reading these classics will always have more power than a secondary source interpretation. Try not to see the theories of Karl as right or wrong, but rather as one of the big books of the world. Understand that Marx in the context of his world, and try to determine what theory is relevant in our time. That's actually very sage advice. That's basically the same reason I wanted to do this. And don't worry, if you're in chat, I can see, everything you're saying. So don't think that, just because I'm reading, I don't see you. And who knows, we'll stop along the way and do some fun stuff. So, who knows what you might discover, some idea or insight not yet uncovered in the original sources. Do not feel obligated to read the book cover to cover. Rather, do as I, dive into a chapter or section that interests you and work your way around from there. Says the foreword by Mark Biernat, St. Augustine, Florida, 2017. Now, Mark is suggesting that. I, however, probably over the next few years, will be working my way through the entire thing, cover to cover. Y'all ready to suffer? we might just do volume 1. We'll see where we're at after that. So you have over 2,000 pages. So yeah, the This is a hefty PDF, and I got this PDF. Where did I get this PDF? Let me check that. So I got this PDF at politicaleconomy.com/capital-Karl-Marx. And this is, as previously shown by Mark Biernat. So that's where you can find it if you want to read along or find this PDF for yourself. So this is Part 1, Commodities and Money. So, Volume 1, Chapter 1, Commodities. Section 1. The two factors of a commodity, the use value and value. The substance of value and the magnitude of value. It's been a while since I read it, but essentially the difference should be that the use value is its actual usefulness, and then its value as, denoted by currency and by the systems we find ourselves in. Let's see, is anyone in the Discord? No, it's just me. Okay, so let's begin. So, 1.1.1, the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of commodity. So yeah, you have an industrial nation, it produces things, and so, sort of its entire wealth, at the time, and still today even to some extent, is based on what it produces. Nowadays it doesn't necessarily even have to be a physical object, it can be something more obscure like tech or intellectual properties. But generally, the wealth of a region is generally based around one key export. So we have to analyze, what that commodity is and learn what it is. So a commodity is, in the first place, an object outside of us, a thing that, by its property, satisfies human wants of some sort or another. The nature of such wants, whether, for instance, they spring from the stomach or from fancy, makes no difference. Neither are we here concerned to know how the object satisfies these wants, whether directly as a means of subsistence or indirectly as a means of production. Every useful thing, as iron and paper, may be looked at from the 2 points of view of quality and quantity. It is an assemblage of many properties and may therefore be of use in various ways. To discover the various use of things is the work of history. So also is the establishment of socially recognized standards of measure for the quantities of these useful objects. The diversity of these measures has its origin partly in the diverse nature of the objects to be measured, partly in convention. That's a lot of stuff, isn't it? So also is the establishment of socially recognized. So essentially what we're saying here is that, the value of things is determined by history and by socially recognized standards of measure. Not necessarily its actual usefulness. And that's what we were saying in the previous part, that it doesn't really matter, if it's chocolate, if it's, a luxury good that, you don't necessarily need, or a basic necessity. That doesn't determine something's price, or, how much it's valued one way or another as a commodity. The utility of a thing makes it a use value. The utility of a thing makes it a use value. But this utility is not a thing of air. Being limited by the physical properties of the commodity, it has no existence apart from that commodity. A commodity such as iron or corn or diamond is therefore, so far as it is a material thing, a use value, something useful. This property of a commodity is independent from the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. When treating of use value, we always assume to be dealing with definite quantities, such as a dozen of watches, yards of linen, or tons of iron. The use values of commodities furnish the material for a special study, that of the commercial knowledge of commodities. Use value becomes a reality only by use or consumption. They also constitute the substance of all wealth, whatever may be the social form of that wealth. In the form of society we are about to consider, they are, in addition, the material depositories of exchange value. So what is exchange value? Exchange value, at first sight, presents itself as a quantitative relation, as the proportion in which value in use of one sort are exchanged for those of another. A relation constantly changing with time and place. Hence, exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value, an exchange that is inseparably connected with, inherent in commodities, seems a contradiction of terms. So let us consider the matter a little more closely. Given a commodity, example, a quarter of wheat is exchanged for X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold. In short, for other commodities in most different proportions. Instead of one exchange value, the wheat has, therefore, a great many. But since X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold each represent the exchange value of a quarter of wheat, these objects must, as exchange values, be replaceable by each other or equal to each other. Therefore, first, goodness, I damaged my headphone. Sorry. Therefore, first, the valid exchange values of a given commodity express something equal. Secondly, exchange value generally is only the mode of expression, the phenomenal form, or something to be contained in it, yet distinguishable from it. So what are we saying here? So obviously all objects, under a capitalist system have a perceived value, and that these values, are interchangeable. So, if one thing is valued at $1 and another thing is valued at $1, that exchanging those two things, at the same quantity, they need to be equal. And that all things at the quantity valued at $1 should be able to be exchanged equally. That, makes sense. So let us take two commodities, corn and iron. The proportions in which they are exchangeable, whatever those proportions may be, can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. So 1/4 of corn equals a X amount of iron. So what does this equation tell us? It tells us that in two different things, in 1/4 of iron and X amount of iron, or 1/4 of corn and an X amount of iron, there exists in equal quantities something common in both. The two things must therefore be equal to a third, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. Each of them, so far as it is exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third. So this could be the medium of cash, or just like some, ephemeral third object, diamonds or lampshades or whatever. But, these two objects, that there's always, a third and technically infinite amount of other objects at play that also have an exchange value that can be, similar to theirs in the right amount of quantity. So a simple geometrical illustration will make this clear. In order to calculate and compare the areas of rectilinear figures, we decompose them into triangles. Oh, jeez. But the area of the triangle itself is expressed by something totally different from its visible figures, namely by half the product of the base into the altitude. In the same way, the exchange value of commodities must be capable of being expressed in terms of something common to them all, of which thing they represent a greater or less quantity. I'm not good at math, but I get what he's saying. I just can't really explain it back. Which I suppose says I don't really get what he's saying, but essentially he's just saying put it on a graph. And that this can be, graphed out. This common something cannot be either a geometrical, chemical, or any other natural property of commodities. Such properties claim our attention only insofar as they affect the utility of those commodities, make them use values. But the exchange of commodities is evidently an act characterized by the total abstraction from use value. Then one use value is as good as another, provided only it be present in sufficient quantity. Or, as old Barbon says, I don't know who Barbon is, says one sort of wares are as good as another, if the values be equal. There is no difference or distinction in the things of equal value. 100 pounds worth of lead or iron is as great a value as 100 pounds worth of silver or gold. As use values, commodities are, above all, of different qualities, but as exchange values, they are merely different quantities, and consequently do not contain an atom of use value. So yes, under a capitalistic system, the actual usefulness of a product is essentially meaningless. Its only importance is how we actually value it, and thus, how much of it do you have. Its actual usefulness is kind of meaningless. And you only need to look at a shopping network to see that, there is completely useless crap being sold, but because, it's given a value, it is thus sort of blessed, as we say, with a value, even though its actual, usefulness is absolutely nothing. Y'all ever seen those bacon cooking racks that they sell? Those are completely useless. Who needs that? Just cook it in the pan, dumbass. And yet, because it exists, and because it's being sold, it has a value. And therefore, is basically, to the minds of, a businessman, about as valuable as gold, really, in enough quantities. But we all know, in reality, that those objects are essentially useless and thus have no real use value. I hate capitalism so fucking much. We just produce all this useless crap. And it's like, nah, bro, that's got use. Don't worry about it. It's valuable. I'll fucking give you some silver for fucking bacon rack or an automatic dog washer. Bro. Bro. Alright. So let's get back to reading. So if then we leave out of consideration the use value of commodities, they have only one common property left, that of being products of labor. But even the products of labor itself have undergone a change in our hands. If we make abstraction from its use value, we make abstraction at the same time from the material elements and shapes that make the product a use value. We no longer see it as a table, a house, yarn, or any other useful thing. Its existence as a material thing is put out of sight. Neither can it any longer be regarded as the product of labor of the joiner, the mason, or the spinner, or of any other kind of productive labor. Along with the useful qualities of the product themselves, we put out of sight both the useful character of the various kinds of labor embodied in them and the concrete forms of that labor. There is nothing left but what is common to them all. All are reduced to one and the same sort of labor, the human labor in the abstract. So essentially, under a system of money, and even under communism, I suppose, though I would argue it's a little bit different, we don't look at things, by how useful they are, but rather the mere fact that it took, work by someone to get it to the point that it's at is what sort of instills it with its value. And that, I would agree to. I would agree that the fact that someone has worked it gives it use value, but, and this is, I think, where Marx is going to make his critique. Again, I don't remember this book because I read it a long time ago. I actually have it sitting with me right here on my table. So this is my copy of the book. I got it at a garage sale, and I think it was made in like the 20s. It's a good book, but it's been a while since I've read it. And this one actually is only it's only volume 1, whereas this PDF I have contains the other volumes as well. So distinction needs to be made. But yeah, so an object is given its value by the fact that someone had to, donate their time to make it true. The difference with a capital society and one that's run by the workers, though, the people who make the shit, is do we, as a social group, value something merely by the fact that labor went into making it, or do we value something based on its actual, utility, its usefulness to us. And that's an interesting question, I would say, that I personally would say that the main metric of something's value should be based on its usefulness, but that we need to take a broad look at what entails usefulness, because something like a song or a stage play or a rubber ball doesn't technically have any direct usefulness to our survival, but that I think the fact that something can also enrich the human experience, and again, this is something that our gentleman Carl mentions earlier. He's saying that under capital, whether it enriches or whether it is necessary for basic survival, it doesn't really matter. Everything has a certain exchange rate, and I think that that's honestly not completely fair, but that I think in the modern age, where we are right now, especially with just absolute crap getting produced and destroying the world based on the production of this crap that nobody actually needs or wants, there does need to be a major re-examination of why we produce things and to what end are we producing things. And the old model is that of the profit motive. You have people produce things because you want to make money off of it. And I think, this is my own personal views on it. I think instead we need to be producing things based on utility. And this is kind of my utilitarian side showing through, but utility as based in my sort of broader definition instead of a more narrow view of it. That's my take. What do you think, Chad? They're all asleep. Good night, Chat. So, let's get back to our book. So now, in fact, let me get a drink of water first. And we'll see how long I can go. We're at 34 minutes. I might be able to go for 2 hours. So let us now consider the residue of these products. It consists of the same unsubstantial reality in each. A mere... Oh, I just want to say that your voice is lovely to exercise to. Better than an audiobook. Why, thank you. So, let us now consider the residue of these products. It consists of the same unsubstantial reality in each. A mere congelation, I've never seen that word used, of homogeneous human labor, of labor power expended without regard to the mode of its expenditure. All that these things tell us is that human labor power has been expended in their production, that human labor is embodied in them. When looked at as crystals of this social substance common to them all, they are values. This is kind of what I, not to toot my own horn, but this is, kind of what I mentioned earlier. So we have seen that when commodities are exchanged, their exchange value manifests itself as something totally independent of their usefulness. But if we abstract from their use value, there remains their value as defined above. Therefore, the common substance that manifests itself in the exchange value of commodities, whenever they are exchanged, is their value. The progress of our investigation will show that exchange value is the only form in which the value of commodities can manifest itself or be expressed. Let me read that one more time. The progress of our investigation will show that the exchange value, the value it has when being exchanged, is the only form in which the value of commodities, products, can manifest itself or be expressed. For the present, however, we have to consider the nature of value independently of this, its form. So that is very important to remember is that under the system we currently find ourselves, the only way we can value, these material things that we create is through our ability to exchange them with one another. Not their actual usefulness. That's not how we value things. We value things based on, what we value them as, speculation essentially. And that under a capital system, everything has a speculative value. One reason why markets are so volatile, as again, I do remember this much, Carl will go on to say. And boy howdy, isn't it cool that that every 10 years or so, the market system that we find ourselves in just explodes. What was it? Wasn't it 2008 when the housing bubble burst? I feel like it was earlier than that. But well, let me double check that. 2008 housing bubble. Okay, so yeah, the housing bubble happened in 2008, and there was an economic recession. And now, in 2020, it looks like we're going to be seeing another one. So that is about 12 years apart. So that's not even really a full generation gone by before the market explodes again. Really cool and really awesome that this totally unnatural force, because again, it's not like there was a disaster in 2008 that caused all the houses to disappear. Like I can kind of understand the current one that's about to happen, though it was forming even before the virus. But it's not like all the houses disappeared in 2008, not like an ocean monster swallowed all the houses. It's that we speculated, and that we speculated too far, So it was an entirely artificial crisis that really didn't have to happen, and yet it ruined people's lives. And that's the thing about, crises or crises of capital, is that oftentimes, they're very, I wouldn't say subtle, but I would say that, the artificiality of them often goes overlooked. Okay. I think this is where we were at. That's right. We've been going for 40 minutes and we're on page 7. Good. think we'll probably end up only doing volume 1. Alright, now back to the book. So a use value, or useful article, therefore has value only because human labor in the abstract has been embodied or materialized in it. How then is the magnitude of this value to be measured? Plainly by the quantity of value creating labor. So the labor contained in the article. The quantity of labor, however, is measured by its duration. The labor time in its turn finds its standard in weeks, days, and hours. So, when you're at work, your average Joe is going to get paid by the hour. So that's an easy example of what we're talking about, how useful things that are created are measured by the amount of labor it required to make said thing. So if it took 15 hours to make something, it's going to be, more expensive than, or more valuable, quote unquote, than something that took an hour to make. And I think that is honestly a much more fair, way if we are going to, even if we are going to continue capital, that's a more fair way of valuing something. And to some extent, that's how we do it here under capital. Though obviously that's not the main model. A chair, for instance, could take 10 hours to make. And so we're going to value that more than, the hamburger, which took, or not the hamburger, that's a bad example because there's a lot of pieces going on there. But that's more valuable than the sharpened stick, which took, 10 minutes of whittling to make. But it's weird. Alright, give me 1 second.
I'm coming in if you don't open the door.
Okay, sorry, I had to deal with something really quick. Now we're back. Isn't my family a delight? So, some people might think that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor spent on it, the more idle and unskillful the labor, the more valuable would his commodity be, because the more time would be required in its production. The labor, however, that forms the substance of value is homogeneous human labor, expenditure of one uniform labor power. The total labor power of society, which is embodied in the sum total of the values of all commodities produced by that society, GDP, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power, composed though it be of innumerable individual units. Each of these units, me, you, our cool co-op, each of these units is the same as any other, so far as it has the character of the average labor power of society and takes effect as such. That is, so far as it requires for producing a commodity no more than is needed on an average, no more that is socially necessary. The labor time socially necessary that is required to produce an article Under the normal conditions of production, and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. So the introduction of power looms into England probably reduced by 1/2 the labor required to weave a given quantity of yarn into cloth. The hand loom weavers, as a matter of fact, continue to require the same time as before. But for all that, the product of 1 hour of their labor represented after the change only half an hour's social labor, and consequently fell to 1/2 of its former value. So again, what does this mean? Well, as you get industrialization, as you get the capacity to produce more in less amount of time, your actual value, which should in hypothetical theory be going up, is instead going down. So let's read a quotation, right? But for all that, the product of 1 hour of their labor represented after the change, after the introduction of machinery, is now only half an hour's social labor, and consequently half of its value was taken away, right? So goods are becoming cheaper because it's taking less labor to make them, which should result, for the worker in more for them, a bigger share of the pie. But it doesn't. Interesting. Wonder where that's going. So, we see then that which determines the magnitude of the value of any article is the amount of labor socially necessary, or the labor time socially necessary for its production. Each individual commodity is this connection is to be considered as an average sample of its class. Commodities, therefore, in which equal quantities of labor are embodied, or which can be produced in the same time, have the same value, right? So if you can produce a t-shirt or a hat in the same amount of time, then they should have the same value. The value of one commodity is to the value of any other, as the labor necessary for the production of the one is to that necessary for the production of the other, as values of commodity are only definite masses of our congealed labor time. And that's incredibly true. The value of something is determined, at least under currently, only by how much time it takes for us to make it, is what Carl's saying here. Ooh, my throat is drying out. How are we doing, chat? So, the value of a commodity would therefore remain constant if the labor time required for its production also remained constant. But the latter changes with every variation in the productiveness of labor. So, value of commodity would remain constant if the labor time required for its production also remained constant. But the latter changes with every variation of the productiveness of labor, right? So, depending on how many machines and the skill of the people involved and other factors, the time it takes to produce something can vary. right? So the productiveness is determined by various circumstances, amongst other, by the average amount of the skill of the workman, the state of science, and the degree of its practical application, the social organization of production, the extent and capabilities of the means of production, and by physical conditions. Yeah, me and Carl are saying the same thing. So, for example, the same amount of labor in favorable seasons is embodied in 8 bushels of corn, and in unfavorable only in 4. The same labor extracts from rich mines more metal than from poor mines. Diamonds are of very rare occurrence on the Earth's surface, and henceforth their discovery costs, on average, a great deal of labor time. Consequently, much labor is represented in a small compass. Jacob doubts whether gold has ever been paid for at its full value. This applies still more to diamonds. According to Eschweg, I think that's German, the total produce of the Brazilian diamond mines for the 80 days ending in 1823 had not realized the price of 1.5 years' average production of the sugar and coffee plantations of the same country, although the diamonds cost much more labor and therefore represented more value. With richer mines, the same quantity of labor would embody itself in more diamonds and their value would fall. So even though, these diamond mines in Brazil are only a teensy tiny part of the country, they represent a huge amount of value because of the actual labor time needed for their extraction. Does that make sense? And that if they put more people on it and extracted more diamonds faster, then the value of diamonds would fall because there'd be a glut of them in the market. And it would actually hurt Brazil to ramp up diamond production. If we could succeed at a small expenditure of labor in converting carbon into diamonds, I've got some news for you, Carl. Their value might fall below that of bricks. In general, the greater the productiveness of labor, the less is the labor time required for the production of an article, the less its amount of labor crystallized in that article, and the less is its value, and vice versa. The less productiveness of labor, the greater is the labor time required for the production of an article, and the greater its value. The value of a commodity, therefore, varies directly as the quantity and inversely as the productiveness of labor incorporated in it. It's interesting, that statement, because, you say that, and yet we now have the capacity to artificially create diamonds, right? And I'm obviously no expert on the diamond market, but to my knowledge, they're still incredibly expensive. Is this because creating artificial diamonds is also incredibly labor intensive? I don't know. I would have to look more into that. But interesting, isn't it? How are we doing, chat? Okay, I think once we get to section 2, we'll take a little break. Okay, so a thing can be a use value without having value. This is the case whenever its utility to man is not due to labor. Such are air, virgin soil, natural meadows, etc. A thing can be useful and the product of human labor without being a commodity. Whoever directly satisfies his wants with the produce of his own labor creates indeed use values, but no commodities. So, in order to produce the latter, he must not only produce use values, but use values for other social use values. Lastly, nothing can have value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value. I mean, going back to my, bacon rack, machines, that's kind of useless. And, really doesn't have any use value per se. And yet is given a commodity value. And that's the weirdness of the system we find ourselves in, is we produce a lot of genuinely useless junk that we still give a value to. And I think that's, one of the big critiques that can be gained from this first section. Oh, I saw Bruja was in here. Damn, I want to call them back. Let's see. I think my Discord is being a little weird right now. No, come back. Okay. Alright, so we're going to take a short break. I'm going to see how long section 2 is, and we'll see if we can do that today. Chet, so what do you think of this so far? What are your reflections? We are about 1% done with this book. What are your thoughts, chat? I wanna hear, and we can maybe reflect on this together, especially in the context of our own world. Let's see, it's about 10 pages. I think we can do section 2 today. Let's see. Bruja, you're here as well, and I'm guessing you can hear me. What are your thoughts if you were listening in on any of our capital readings so far? What do you think about it? And if you don't feel like talking, that's okay.
I just joined, so I have no thoughts nor opinions.
No thoughts nor opinions. Head empty.
Yes.
Let's see.
Yeah.
Here, can you speak one more time? I want to make sure you're coming through on stream.
Am I coming through on stream?
Oh yeah,
Test.
you are.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Well, you ready to get into section 2, Bruja?
Yeah.
All right. I didn't break my headphone, did I? That's crazy, bro. All right.
Would be any indication that you broke it?
Just like one of the little buds is out. That's weird. All right. Well, we can talk about that later. Let's get into section 2. Let's get real boring with the twofold character of the labor embodied in commodities. Ooh, ah. Alright. So, at first sight, a commodity presented itself to us as a complex of two things. Its use value, how actually useful something is, and its exchange value. How much can you exchange it for something else? Later on, we saw also that labor too possesses that same nature. Ooh. So far as it finds itself in expression in value, it does not possess the same characteristics that belong to it as a creator of use values. I was the first to point out, okay, Carl, very humble. I was the first to point out and to examine critically this twofold nature of the labor contained in commodities, as this point is the pivot on which a clear comprehension of political economy turns. We must go more into detail. So yes, labor, the same way as commodities, can be valued based on its usefulness and its ability to be exchanged for goods and services, right? That's fair. That's fair. Oh, whoops. Oh no, I lost my place.
At it again with the humble brag.
No, I was the first. It was me. Y'all bitches better listen up. Okay, so let us take two commodities, such as a coat and 10 yards of linen, and let the former be double the value of the latter, so that if 10 yards of linen equals W, the coat then equals 2W. The coat is a use value that satisfies a particular want. Its existence is the result of a special sort of productive activity, the nature of which is determined by its aim, its mode of operation, subject, means, and result. The labor whose utility is thus represented by the value in use of its product, or which manifests itself by making its product a use value, we call useful labor. In this connection, we consider only its useful effect. As the coat and the linen are two qualitatively different use values, so also are the two forms of labor that produce them, tailoring and weaving. Were these two objects not qualitatively different, not produced represented by labor of different quality, they could not stand to each other in relation of commodities. Coats are not exchanged for coats. One use value is not exchanged for another of the same kind.
Rude.
I mean, I don't know, if one coat had like a sick ass Pikachu logo on it, I'd exchange like a like a boring coat for no.
Okay, fine, but like meet me at the same level. So I give you my cool Gengar hoodie, and you give me your cool Pikachu jacket.
So here's the interesting thing with that, though, right? Is if something has no logo, and if the other thing does that give it now a different amount of commodity, right? Because now I value the one with the symbolism over that with the one without. So now these objects aren't really equal in value in my head anymore, right?
Right, because one is just completely like bland. Well, it's not bland, but one is a basic color solid, and then the other one has like this sick ass Pokemon that you grew up loving.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's an interesting thing too, is that to certain people, different objects might have different amounts of usefulness, right? Like, me, someone who likes a little bit of apple brandy, would get a lot more use out of a bottle of it than someone who, was devoutly Muslim and, swore, not to consume alcohol. Like, that person and me would have different amounts of usefulness for that bottle, right?
Right.
And that's...
And also, sorry, what were you saying?
No, continue.
I was gonna say also, like, someone, whatever, I think what we value, I guess in this context, could also vary, because going back to that, like, Pokemon inference, maybe someone doesn't like Pokemon or doesn't really care for Pokemon, so they just value the simple jacket more because they find it more practical, which is, I guess, another example of what you were saying.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of usefulness of coats, I find myself directly under the air conditioning unit, so I am going to find this flannel I'm putting on much more useful than someone who lives in the desert. Ooh.
Yeah!
Well, I kind of do both, now that I think about it. Both live under the air conditioning unit and in a desert. But, yeah, it is interesting to think, is there a cultural component to use value?
Oh, I think there is. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say so as well. And, that sort of speaks to maybe kind of the importance of analyzing intersections in modern socialist theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, and it would be a bit crass of me to make assumptions, but I feel like earlier, socialist theorists in Marx's day probably would not have, taken that analysis. I don't know, though. I haven't read this book again in quite some time, so I could be wrong on that point. But yeah, I would also say there is a cultural aspect to use values sometimes. All right.
Yeah.
So to all different value, or to all the different varieties of values in use, there correspond as many different kinds of useful labor, classified according to the order, genus, and species and variety to which they belong in the social division of labor. This division of labor is a necessary condition for the production of commodities, but it does not follow conversely that the production of commodities is a necessary condition for the division of labor. In the primitive Indian community, there is a social division. Okay, Carl. There's a social division of labor without production of commodities. I would push back on that a little bit, Carl, but alright. Again, this is a product of its time, and so we're reading it as such.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, can you have commodities, without industrialism, or without an industrial society? Yes. I wouldn't, single out a specific community for this, but I would say, those living in situations of subsistence rather than, commodity production, you can say that there is a division of labor, without the production of commodities. Again, I wouldn't single out any culture that existed at the period. But, if you're in, like, subsistence farming, then yes, there will be a division of labor. Someone farms the field, someone forges the tools, but they're not really producing, commodities. They aren't really, trading it more. They're just cooperating for subsistence. Or,
Yeah.
okay, so, sorry, got a little off topic there, but, or to take an example nearer to home, in every factory, the labor is divided according to a system, but this division is not brought about by the operatives mutually exchanging their individual products. Only such products can become commodities with regard to each other as a result of different kinds of labor, each kind being carried on independently for the account of private individuals. To resume then, in the use value of each commodity there is contained useful labor, i.e. productive activity of a definitive kind and exercised with a definitive aim, or a definite aim. Use values cannot confront each other as commodities unless the useful labor embodied in them is qualitatively different in each other. In a community, the produce of which in general takes the form of commodities, i.e. in a community of commodity producers, this qualitative difference between the useful forms of labor that are carried out on independently by individual producers, each on their own account, develops into a complex system, a social division of labor. So yeah, Carl is pointing out people be specializing when things get complicated. Fair.
Yeah. That kind of makes sense.
And, if a task is especially complicated, then yeah, over time you will see the rise of a group of people who, specialize in completing that task. The easiest example, right, is, and division of labor isn't even a bad thing. I would argue it's quite useful in places because, for example, you want your surgeon to be someone who is specifically trained to be a surgeon, right?
True.
You don't want a guy who is a surgeon right now and then on the weekends, works at the barbecue hut. Like you want a guy who his full-time thing is being good at surgery. And that's true for a lot of products, I would say. And specializing and mastering something, I would say is good. There is a socialist idea that, says that, once we seize the means of production, we won't have this specialization. People can drift from job to job. And I don't hear a lot of socialists preaching it, but I would push back on it and say, that you still want the specialization of labor, because it's a good way to cultivate, skill for certain fields, and as well, and this is from an organizing standpoint, if you have people specializing and getting attached to a field of labor, there's a much stronger feeling of kinship with those who practice a similar form of labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you are an iron worker for 15 years of your life, you're going to be very attached to being an iron worker. You're going to feel a strong kinship for it, and you're going to be able to relate a lot better to people who also do iron work. And so, if someone is then screwing over iron workers, you're going to be much more equipped to collectively organize and deal with that. So I'm actually quite for specialization of labor. again, this is kind of a tangent, but let's get back now. So, anyhow, whether the coat, the coat with the Pikachu on it, be worn by the tailor or by his customer, in either case it operates as a use value. Nor is the relation between the coat and the laborer that produced it altered by the circumstances that tailoring may have become a special trade and independent branch of the social division of labor. Whether the want of clothing forced them to it, the human race made clothes for thousands of years without a single man becoming a tailor. But coats and linen, like every other element of material wealth that is not the spontaneous produce of nature, must invariably owe their existence to the special productive activity exercised with a definite aim, an activity that appropriates particular nature-given materials to the particular human wants. So far, therefore, as labor is a creator of use value, is useful labor, it is a necessary condition, independent of all forms of society, for the existence of the human race. It is an eternal, nature-imposed necessity, without which there can be no material exchanges between man and nature, and therefore no life. Whew. Yeah, people be working. That's about it. The use value, coat, linen, etc., the bodies of commodities, are combinations of two elements of matter and labor. If we take away the useful labor expended upon them, a material substratum is always left, which is furnished by nature without the helping of man. The latter can work only as nature does, that is, by changing the form of matter. Nay, more, in this work of changing the form, he is constantly helped by natural forces. We see then that labor is not the only source of material wealth, of use values produced by labor. As William Petty puts it, labor is its father, and the earth is its mother. So yeah, in use value, you see, materials that come from nature, and you see, labor, and you see the combination of those two creating its use value. So now, let us pass from the commodity considered as a use value to the value of commodities. By our assumption, the coat is worth twice as much as the linen, but this is a mere quantitative difference, which for the present does not concern us. Instead, we bear in mind, however, that if the value of the coat is double that of 10 yards of linen, 20 yards of linen must have the same value as the coat. So far as they are values, the coat and the linen are things of a like substance, objects, expressions of essentially identical labor. But tailoring and weaving are qualitatively different kinds of labor. There are, however, states of society in which one and the same man does tailoring and weaving alternately, in which case these two forms of labor are mere modifications of the labor of the same individual. Hello, Neck Yoga. And not special and fixed functions of different persons, just as the coat which our tailor made one day and the trousers which he made another day imply only a variation in the labor of one individual to the same individual. Moreover, we see at a glance that in our society, our capitalistic society, a given portion of human labor is in accordance with the varying demand, at one time supplied in the form of tailoring, at another in the form of weaving. This change may possibly not take place without friction, but take place it must. Alright, Ooh, that was a long bit of reading. And yeah, I'm learning that I'll probably only be able to read for about an hour and a half before my voice starts giving way. But we're doing good. Next yoga, since you're just freshly here, have you read Capital? Do you find anything interesting from these early parts? Okay, so now we're on section 1.28. So productive labor, or productive activity, if we leave out of sight its special form, the useful character of the labor, is nothing but the expenditure of human labor power. Right? So productive activity is just you working, right? Irregardless of what kind of work it is. So tailoring and weaving, though qualitatively different productive activities, are each a productive expenditure of the human brain, nerves, and muscles, and in this sense are human labor. They are but two different modes of expending human labor power. Of course, this labor power, which remains the same under all its modifications, must have attained a certain pitch of development before it can be expended in a multiplicity of modes. But the value of a commodity represents human labor in the abstract, the expenditure of human labor in general. And just as in society, a general or a banker plays a great part, but mere man, on the other hand, a very shabby part, so here, with mere human labor, it is the expenditure of simple labor power, the labor power which, on average, apart from any special development, exists in the organism of every individual. Simple, average labor, it is true, varies in character in different countries and at different times, but in particular society it is given. Skilled labor counts only as simple labor intensified, or rather, as multiplied simple labor, a given quantity of skilled being considered equal to a great quantity of simple labor. So obviously, if you spend years mastering a craft, you're still doing simple labor, just on a different scale of that labor, right? So experience shows that this reduction is constantly being made. A commodity may be the product of the most skilled labor, but its value, by equating it to the product of simple unskilled labor, represents a definite quality of the latter labor alone. The different proportions in which different sorts of labor are reduced to unskilled labor as their standard are established by the social process that goes on behind the backs of the producers and consequently appears to be fixed by custom. For simplicity's sake, we shall henceforth account every kind of labor to be unskilled simple labor. By this we do no more than save ourselves the trouble of making the reduction. And that's kind of true in the wider sense, in the modern age, because there is this kind of this minimum wageification of labor we're seeing in the modern age, right? So, for example, I was listening to this podcast, right? And they had someone doing very, very complicated chemical work, right? But he was being assumed to be giving, minimum wage, which is generally equivocated to unskilled simple labor, despite the fact that he definitely was not doing simple labor. And I would even argue that most labor nowadays is not something that can be quantified as simple. Almost everything today requires years of practice to do. All right, so 1129. How much longer is this bit? Okay, only a few more pages. Yeah, I think once we get to section 3, I'm gonna stop. Stop reading. That is, I might still keep streaming. Bruja, Sweet Potato. What are your thoughts on what we've read so far? That's okay if you're feeling quiet right now. That's all good. Okay, yeah, I didn't mute myself on accident. Okay, so 1129. Just as, therefore, in viewing the coat and linen as values, we abstract from their different use values, so it is with the labor represented by those values, we disregard the difference between its useful forms, weaving and tailoring. As the use values, coat and linen are combinations of special productive activities, with cloth and yarn, while values, the linen and the coat, are, on the other hand, merely homogeneous conjugations of indifferentiated labor. So, the labor embodied in these latter values does not count by virtue of its productive relation to cloth and yarn, but only as being expenditure of human labor power. So, tailoring and weaving are necessary factors in the creation of these use values, and the coat and linen precisely because these two kinds of labor are different qualities, but only insofar as abstraction is made from their special qualities, only insofar that both possess the same quality of being human labor, do tailoring and weaving form the substantive values of the same articles. Man, can't believe Carl is banned in some countries. Like, I like reading this stuff, but I will be the first to admit it is stale as a fucking piece of bread.
I am drawing to see if that helps me.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, right? Is I'm hoping by putting this into audio form, I can sort of demystify and make it a little bit easier to access. All right, so coats and linen, however, are not merely values, but values of definite magnitude. And according to our assumption, the coat is worth twice as much as the 10 yards of linen. Where did this whence this difference in their values? It is owing to the fact that the linen contains only half as much labor as the coat, and consequently that in production of the later, labor power must have been expended during twice the time necessary of production of the former. So, Carl is saying that how much time you spend making something is basically, equatable to how valuable it is.
So it doesn't matter what it is you're making, so long as the effort and the time that it takes to make it.
Mm-hmm. And he's also he's talking about this in the context of labor power and not its usefulness, right? So, even though the coat in theory is more valuable than just 10 yards of linen, right? Like your average Joe's going to get more use out of the coat. He's saying that it's deriving more value based on how much time it took to make than the fact of usefulness. He's, saying ignore that. He's getting to that. While therefore, with reference to use value, the labor contained in a commodity counts only qualitatively. With reference to value, it counts only quantitatively and must first be reduced to human labor pure and simple. In the former case, it is a question of how and what, in the latter of how much. How much or how long a time, since the magnitude of the value of a commodity represents only the quantity of labor embodied in it, it follows that all commodities, when taken in certain proportions, must be equal in value. Right? So, it takes me... let's use Minecraft as a metaphor, right? It takes me a minute to mine obsidian, and it takes me a minute to mine, like two or three blocks of coal, right? If that's the case, then they are equal in value because they take just as much time of my labor. Is basically what Carl is putting forward here.
Okay. Now, what if we have same item that's being extracted, but for someone else, it takes much longer to extract that item? Does that... it puts it at more value because more labor, or it took more time to...
Yeah, so let's say, and a good example of this, right, is oil. Okay, so in some places, right, like Saudi Arabia, the oil's just coming out of the ground. You can just walk up, grab a bucket. I don't know if this is actually true or not, but I'm just making up something. You can just walk up, get a bucket, and get a barrel of oil in like 5 minutes, right? Whereas in Anwar, Alaska, right, it's under a deep layer of permafrost, and it's in, Alaska, which is generally a tough location for people to get to. So, in a case like that, right, you're getting the same amount of oil, but because it is taking you, a longer time, a longer amount of time to produce it in Alaska, then the Alaskan oil is more expensive because it takes more time of labor, and that's kind of represented realistically in our own world.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why, even though the US has the capacity to produce oil, right, why their oil tends to be a little bit more expensive is because it's harder to gain access to. And, thus takes a longer amount of time to produce. Hello, Kumi Worm. That's a cool name.
I like it.
How you doing? We're reading For anyone who's just joined, we're reading Capital by Karl Marx, and we are on section 1.1.33, and you can get this, again, for anyone who wants to read along, at politicaleconomy.com/capital-Karl-Marx. And honestly, with Theory Thursday, I don't think most are going to be this dry. Well, don't worry, Kumi, because after we're done reading, a whole lot of this section that we've read will be going up on the Bardic Interrogation YouTube channel, and you can just listen to us reading Capital and sort of hashing it out, not really annotating, but discussing it as we go. So we are now on section 1.1.33, and let's begin. Actually, let me get a drink, then we'll start. An increase in the quantity of use values is an increase of material wealth. With 2 coats, 2 men can be clothed. With 1 coat, only 1 man. Nevertheless, an increased quantity of material wealth may correspond to a simultaneous fall in the magnitude of its value. This antagonistic movement has its origin in the twofold character of labor. Productive power has reference, of course, only to labor of some useful concrete form, the efficacy of any special productive activity during a given time being dependent on its productiveness. Useful labor becomes, therefore, a more or less abundant source of products, in proportion to the rise or fall of productiveness. On the other hand, no change in this productiveness affects the labor represented by value. Since productive power is an attribute of the concrete useful forms of labor, of course, it can no longer have any bearing on that labor. So soon as we make abstraction from those concrete useful forms. However, then productive power may vary. The same labor, exercised during equal periods of time, always yields equal amounts of value. But it will yield, during equal periods of time, different quantities of values in use. More if the productive power rises, fewer if it falls. The same change in productive power, which increases the fruitfulness of labor, and in consequence the quantity of use values produced by that labor, will diminish the total value of this increased quantity of use values, provided such change shorten the total labor time necessary for production, and vice versa. On the one hand, all labor is, speaking physiologically, an expenditure of human labor power, and in its character of identical abstract human labor, it creates and forms the value of commodities. On the other hand, all labor is the expenditure of human labor power in a special form and with a definite aim, and in this, its character of value, its character of concrete, useful labor, it produces use values. Whoa, that was a handful, and we're on page 20, section 3, and my voice is starting to give way, so we are going to stop reading there for today, and we'll pick it up next Theory Thursday. So, that last bit there is talking about how as you get more of a good being produced. Well, don't worry, Lin Wu. A VOD will be going up on the YouTube channel, so you can watch that back later. And I'm probably going to stay streaming for a little bit. Who knows? But what we're saying here, essentially, in this last bit, is that as more of something is produced, right? As there is a glut of it in a market, its use value, the actual usefulness of that object is diminished, right? Because less people need it, frankly, right? So if everyone has coats, then nobody needs to be getting a new coat, and so the use value of that coat that you're producing now is going to decrease. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And as gets talked about in later sections, this is sort of the great problem of the capitalist system, right? Is you produce goods because you're going to make profit off of it, right? But tons of people are producing these goods, so you end up in a situation, the crisis of excess, where everyone has that good, and so you no longer have anyone to sell to, and thus the value of the good you are making plummets. And that's how you get bubbles, right, in economies, where now there's too much of this on the market, so its value goes down, meaning your company's value goes down, meaning even though nothing was lost, you're technically losing value, and people get poorer just out of nowhere. And, this doesn't just happen with, coats. If it only happened with coats, it wouldn't be a big deal. But this happens, with every good. This happens, as in with 2008, with housing, right? And this happens with, Apple computers. This happens with anything you can think of. You produce too much, and your company loses value, when in fact it should, under a non capitalistic system, be retaining the same amount of value, because you're still, no matter how much of a coat or a house is on a market, it still retains to wisdom that it takes the same amount of time to produce that, whether there's one coat on the market or 1,000. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Marx, when he's writing this, obviously, he's writing to other philosophy nerds, right? Like he wasn't expecting this to... He was writing to other academics. He wasn't expecting this to get into the hands of common folk. He was expecting this just to be read by other philosophers. And so he's, writing this, in the style of an academic text. So when reading Capital, it is ironically both an important introduction text to understanding socialism, and also incredibly dense and distancing.
It's painful.
Mm-hmm.
let's just say that it's painful. It's not accessible.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not the first person to do a let's read. And so I would say, if you're going to get into capital, I would definitely recommend, some sort of lightened form of it. So out there, there exists, annotated versions. And that'd be good to go to. Because this PDF I have, I don't know if you can see it, but you see how I'm on page 30, right? It's page 30 of 2,500.
Oh gosh.
So, I'm certain all my audience would like me to go to 2,600 pages. I'm not doing that. I am not. No, 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 no. We're just gonna stretch, and say, all right, chat. So what did you think of this reading? What sort of marketplace of ideas, big brain thoughts are like coursing through your heads, really getting some idea juices flowing in here? I want to hear your thoughts, chat. I want to hear how you take this information and how you think it reflects upon the world that we find ourselves in. And then Bruja and Sweet Potato, of course, you are more than free to chip in as well. Nothing? Just sort of broiling in the thoughts?
Roiling in the thoughts, and also just like, because how like if everyone has, say, like a coat or a jacket, then ultimately the value kind of decreases. And I'm thinking like, okay, that's probably why like everyone likes, a lot of these companies make subtle variations of the exact same thing. And also like, even some brands, you notice that there's like this weird kind of exclusivity that kind of gives that feeling of, I want to say the term scarcity, like a false scarcity, even with other products, I'd say, like with food. Yeah.
Well, yeah, like, what's his name? Kanye West, right? Like, he could just make shoes, right? But everyone's got shoes, And
Exactly.
and like Nike, already dominates the business. So it's not like he'd be adding anything new if he was just making shoes. So he can't just make shoes, right? He has to make Yeezys. He has to make a new category of product, right? And by creating this new category, and this is something, capitalists do all the time, is he is doing something really devious when you think about it. He is creating the need and the way to fulfill that need at the same time, right? So, Yeezys they don't do anything more useful than any other shoe, but that exclusivity in and of itself creates the category of it being also a status symbol. And so now there's this need to prove your status, right? And so not only, do you need a shoe, but you also need a Yeezy to prove a status that you hold within your social structure, right? And I think that the brands that do that, that's really devious. I dislike it, but I will fully admit that is an incredibly intelligent ploy by them. Yeah, stuff like that blows me away.
want to be part of the cool boys club.
Exactly. I think that's a really interesting note to end it on. And to everyone watching right now, I'm gonna oh jeez, am I still live? I think I'm still live.
Sure.
Okay, that's very weird. Twitch is glitching out for me. But we are going to end the stream there, and let me see if there's another channel I can raid into. Yeah, that's weird. I think it logged me out.
They don't want the people to know the truth.
You are spreading Marxism. You cannot be here. Get off my platform.
Exactly.
Get the fuck off my platform.
It's like who would win? One trans girl reading a book or a media conglomerate? No, that's I think there's just something weird going on with my Twitch. Well, that's too bad. Can anyone link me another lefty channel that's live right now so I can raid into them? Very mysterious. Anyways, after this is over, I'm going to... Okay, there we go. It glitched out for me. Alright, we'll raid into Central Committee. I don't know much about them, but they seem communisty. So we'll do that. And then after this I'm gonna edit the VOD and put it up on the Bardic Interrogation YouTube page. So if you couldn't catch the full stream, and you want to read capital, sections 1 and 2 with us, you'll be able to find it there. And the link to the YouTube page, I think, yes, there's a link to the YouTube page under the orange widget down below. Anyways, it's been nice having you all, and have a good day. We'll be back next Thursday to do this more, and I'll try and be live more often now that I'm done with school, and we'll think of some stuff to do. We'll think of some stuff. Jump into the Discord and throw around some ideas if you have some cool idea for stuff we can do. All right, have a good one.
Pretense that all of that money would be spent on construction. So apparently, according to Strauss, while repeatedly assuring donors that Brian Colfatch, the founder and public face of We Build the Wall, would not be paid a cent